The Justice Department announced Friday it had released more than 3,000 federal inmates as part of the First Step Act. The bipartisan criminal justice reform bill was signed into law by President Trump back in December.
Former Arizona Senator and CBS News contributor Jeff Flake recently met with Senators Cory Booker and Mike Lee to discuss the groundbreaking legislation. It's part of the CBS This Morning series, Common Ground, which highlights people who are setting aside partisan differences and solving problems.
Well, it's an overwhelming feeling, and I'm just glad to be free.
Eric Balcom has waited 16 years for this moment. His first breaths of freedom after being released from federal prison in Jessup, Georgia.
I can't be bitter about all that I've missed. Come on, pick you up. I just gotta be thankful and grateful for the new memories that I can make.
Yes. New memories with his family.
God is good.
Including his daughter, Terica. Ironically, she's a corrections officer in Florida.
Just want you to be all right, Mom.
I'm all right.
There, Balcom reunites with his mother, who's suffering from dementia.
I just have to try to make the best out of the time she have left.
In 2003, when he was 29 years old, Eric Balcom was sentenced to life in prison. The crime? Selling 93.2 grams of crack.
When they say life, it's like somebody could have committed a murder in 2003 and been home before I did.
Balcom had prior offenses, including violent ones. But in prison, he said he rehabilitated himself, taking more than 60 courses, working, and even serving as a suicide companion.
You gotta slow down, TJ. Make sure you don't run into nobody.
He's free because of the First Step Act, a law that reverses the harsh sentencing of the war on drugs era of the 1980s and 90s.
This is a cancer. This problem is a cancer on the soul of our country.
Democratic New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and Republican Utah Senator Mike Lee spent months negotiating the bipartisan bill. Senator Lee, you're a conservative senator from a conservative state, Utah, also a former prosecutor, some would say an unlikely champion of criminal justice reform. Why are you interested in this issue?
I'm interested in this, not in spite of, but because of the fact that I'm a conservative and a former prosecutor. As a former prosecutor, I saw a number of abuses of federal law. I saw a young man named Weldon Angelos get sentenced to 55 years in prison for selling 3 dime bags of pot over a 72-hour period. That's just wrong. The judge sentencing him at the time said this is wrong and only Congress can fix this problem.
Senator Booker, take us behind the scenes to the negotiations.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that relationships matter. Sometimes they surprise you, like the fact that I'm sitting next to a guy from Utah, not the most diverse state, for him to have a sincere concern that we have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves in 1850 and understand the racial dynamics here. So he and I had a real friendship, and it made for a good foundation.
A foundation that Jared Kushner, President Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, built upon.
Jared was a solid ally and one without whom we probably couldn't have gotten this passed.
Was there a moment when you thought it might all fall apart?
In the midst of the Kavanaugh hearings, which you know how hardening that was along partisan lines, I still remember getting on the phone with Jared and he and I being at an impasse and me being, angry and having my back up and ready to upend tables over a provision of the bill. And Jared saying, okay, well, let's conference in Lindsey Graham. And this is at a moment where people on my side of the aisle were not quite happy with Lindsey Graham, to put it mildly. And I still remember Lindsey getting on the phone and being very hard at Jared, saying, we can't do this without Cory. We need to keep this coalition together.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
What can you say to people like Eric and others who have been released under this program?
I mean, there is an anguish in my community. There's an anguish in African American communities. 90% of the people being liberated right now are African Americans. We live in a nation where our criminal justice system is still deeply biased against low-income people, against minorities, and this was a step.
I just want to tell you that I'm sorry.
A step that gave Eric Balcom the opportunity to finally apologize to his son.
I ain't gonna leave you like that.
For Balcom, it's just another step on the long road to redemption.
Well, we are joined now by CBS News contributor and former Arizona Republican Senator Jeff Flake. Thank you so much. This is a very moving story.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't watch that last scene with him crying and apologizing to his son without just saying, oh, man,
I think that, this piece of legislation, if you had told me that this was going to happen before President Trump was in the Oval Office, I would say no way.
Right.
It's really remarkable because this is the sort of reform that, both parties have been trying to do for a while and just couldn't get on the same page. What happened now?
Right, and not only that, but this particular time, this was December, just after the Kavanaugh hearings. It's the Senate, Judiciary Committee that has to carry the load here. That's the most partisan committee in Congress that has just been through this really polarizing time. And I really credit people like Cory Booker, Mike Lee, and Dick Durbin, and Chuck Grassley, and others who just said, no, we're going to stick to it.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. And having the White House involved and positive on it helped as well. There was an opening in the Senate calendar in December, and we pushed it through. And I think all of us were surprised at that it finally went through. And boy, you see the impact now. 3,000 people announced this week will be released early. So that kind of reunion that you saw with Eric Balcom and his family is happening all over the country.
It's always striking when we hear it in your piece, and we've heard this before, that there are more African Americans incarcerated than there were slaves in 1850. Senator Booker saying that. Sadly, Malcolm's mom passed away.
Yes,
she did.
Just a few weeks
ago. And so he lost that whole chunk of his life when he would have been able to spend time with her.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the numbers now, 90% of those who are being released early are African American. And as Cory was saying, this has just been a cancer on that community. And so this makes things better. There are things that still need to happen. A lot of these crimes, that will be on people's records. There needs to be some kind of clemency in some cases so they can more easily move on to work and get on with their lives because it's very difficult being a convicted felon going back to work. So there are other steps that need to be taken, but this is big. And one thing that the piece, we didn't have time to touch on, but what has happened elsewhere in the country at the state level. A lot of this is happening there, and most people are actually sentenced under state laws. So in terms of numbers of people in prison, it's really the state laws. That,
I'm glad that was going to actually be my next question for you, whether or not, showing a good example of what can be done can have a trickle-down effect to lower levels of government.
Interesting you mentioned that. That's a great point. In this case, there was a lot of trickle-up effect. Texas had moved, a decade ago. A bunch of people came together and said, hey, we can't afford, the libertarians, the budget-conscious people said we can't afford to continue to build 2 or 3 prisons a year. The faith community said, we can get in and do some help in terms of rehabilitation. Others were saying, these disparate sentences for African Americans, it has to change. And so for very different reasons, groups came together. And in Texas, they reformed their criminal justice system. 10 years later, they've shut down several prisons rather than building new ones. Recidivism is down, the crime rate is down, and so when it came time to do something at the federal level, one thing we really had going for us was, some conservative senators like John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, who people would think, oh, they'd be against this, tough on crime. They had seen what happened in Texas, and they couldn't deny what had happened, and they were advocates for it. And so there was a triple-up effect, and hopefully in states that haven't done it, this will be a trickle-down, having the federal government. So people learn from each other, and there are examples of common ground being found around the country.
So maybe we could do it on other topics like immigration, where there's,
That'd be good.
That's the big kahuna.
Speaking of immigration, immigrants, naturalized Americans, and American citizens, let's talk about the president and his attacks on these 4 Democratic congresswomen of color known as the Squad. The chants that he let play out for over 13 seconds at a rally. That kind of language, I think what I've seen from Republicans is there's been this pivot away from the language and how it was applied to suggesting that it wasn't about race. And our correspondent at the White House, Weijia Jiang, asked President Trump if somebody told the First Lady, Melania Trump, to go back, how would you feel? Told her to go back to Slovenia. Well, the president never says that to folks like you. He says it to folks like these 4 congresswomen. Given that there are so many people who look like them and who are American citizens, not naturalized Americans, and just in the case of Congresswoman Omar. How does it feel when you see your colleagues not sort of sticking up for their constituents? I mean, these senators and congressmen and women have constituents who are naturalized Americans or who are American citizens, but who may have ancestors that came from other countries. I don't understand how they can continue to deflect.
Neither do I.
You don't?
No, not at all. This was an awful, awful statement. I was always troubled by the lock her up chants. If there's anything worse, it's send her back. That's terrible. No Republican ought to countenance that. Coming from Arizona, we have a large Hispanic population. They've heard that their whole lives. Go back to where you came from. And most of them are people who have been in Arizona. I've been in 5 generations in Arizona. There are many Hispanics who have been there a lot longer than that, and they're told, go back to where you came from. So yeah, that has baffled me as well. I've always said, as a Republican, you get really tired of being asked about the president's latest tweet or latest outrage, and you can't be expected to comment on every one. It's, you don't have enough time in the day. But when the president says something so outrageous like this, it's your responsibility as an elected official to speak out. It's like, the comment, the press is the enemy of the people, that has such an ignoble pedigree. More Republicans should have spoken out at that time. And because now it's used and people don't bat an eye.
Right.
And that puts journalists in danger all over the world. It's a terrible thing.
What do you think then is the perceived advantage to backing up the president, or perceived disadvantage to chastising him?
Well,
something you're very familiar with.
Yeah. I mean, had I been running for re-election, I wouldn't have been able to speak out, or I would have, obviously the president would have campaigned against me. No Republican wants that. When the president says he has, 94% of all Republicans, remember that's a subset of a subset. These are Republicans who vote in primaries, the most diehard, but he's got them. And this is the president's party. And Republicans who want to win re-election, to win a primary in their state, feel that they have to be careful. For me, one thing that weighed on my mind heavily was that, if I'm going to run for re-election, I would need to stand on a campaign stage with the president and have to be okay when people shout, lock her up, or when the president ridicules my Democratic friends, or my colleague John McCain, or others. I couldn't do it. I mean, you just can't. Why?
What strikes me as sort of fascinating as I watch all of this play out is this idea, this notion that, as you point out, there are some politicians who say, well, I'm going to stick with the president because I don't want to be primaried, or I don't want the president to go after me. But long after President Trump is gone, whether he's reelected or not, the sentiment that we heard at that rally will remain.
Yes.
People will say, the president of the United States made comments like that. His own party refused to rebuke him. So when my kid says it to another kid who has a Hispanic-sounding last name, or whose name is Vladimir Duterte, why should we reprimand the child? Because the president of the United States was able to say and get away with it.
Right. Now there's a cartoon going around of a parent scolding the child, don't use presidential language around here.
Have not seen that.
And that is the problem. My fear is that, if you're a conservative, you don't want to elect progressives because, hey, they'll enact progressive policy. But political pendulums swing. And if one party, either progressives or conservatives, move too far in one direction, the pendulum swings, usually in the next election, sometimes with a vengeance. With the kind of language and the kind of culture that's created by this language, I'm not sure that pendulum swings back. And particularly with the overlay of social media, this may be here to stay. And that's what's so dangerous about this time. And that's why it's so, I think, unacceptable and unconscionable that more Republicans won't stand up and say, this is wrong.
So compassionate conservatism is dead in the Republican Party.
That's tough to find right now.
All right, Jeff Flake, thank you so much.
Thank you.